HMP Hull, located in East Yorkshire, is one of the most troubled Victorian-era prisons in England. HMP Hull was established in 1880 during the height of Britain's Victorian prison building era, a time when incarceration was driven more by punishment and deterrence than rehabilitation. Constructed to serve the industrial population of East Yorkshire, the prison reflected 19th-century beliefs that strict discipline, isolation, and rigid control could reform offenders. Its red brick walls, narrow corridors, and high watchtowers were designed to project authority and fear, sending a clear message to both inmates and society outside. The original architectural layout followed the traditional Victorian radial design, allowing guards to observe multiple wings from central points. At the time, this structure was considered efficient and progressive. Prisoners were largely kept in single cells, often in silence, with minimal interaction. This system aimed to force reflection and obedience, but it also laid the groundwork for long-term psychological harm, an issue that still echoes within the prison today. Throughout the early 20th century, HMP Hull housed a wide range of offenders, from petty criminals to those serving long sentences. During both World Wars, the prison faced increased pressure as crime rates fluctuated and resources were diverted elsewhere. Despite social and political changes across Britain, the prison's physical structure remained largely untouched, slowly aging while the world outside modernized. By the mid to late 20th century, attitudes toward criminal justice began to shift. Rehabilitation, education, and mental health support entered public debate, but HMP Hull struggled to adapt. Its Victorian design made modernization difficult, and limited investment meant that new ideas were often applied within old, unsuitable spaces. Classrooms, healthcare units, and workshops were forced into areas never intended for such purposes. The late 1990s and early 2000s marked a turning point as prison populations across England surged. Sentencing policies became tougher, and HMP Hull started to exceed its intended capacity. Cells built for one inmate were converted to hold two, fundamentally altering daily life inside. This overcrowding clashed directly with the prison's original design philosophy, intensifying stress and reducing safety. Historically, HMP Hull has also been linked to periods of unrest, disturbances, and serious incidents, often triggered by poor conditions and overcrowding. These moments are not isolated events, but part of a longer historical pattern rooted in structural limitations and underinvestment. Each generation of inmates inherited the consequences of decisions made more than a century earlier. The surrounding community of Hull has long had a complex relationship with the prison. For decades, it has been both a major local employer and a symbol of social failure. Families, often from deprived backgrounds, have passed through its gates across generations, reflecting broader patterns of inequality in the region and highlighting how history, crime, and poverty intersect. Today, the historical foundations of HMP Hull continue to shape every aspect of life inside. The prison stands as a living relic of Victorian justice, still operating within walls built for a very different era. Its past is not simply history. It is an active force influencing overcrowding, control, and conflict on a daily basis. HMP Hull was built according to Victorian architectural principles that prioritized surveillance, isolation, and control rather than flexibility or humane living conditions. The prison structure was designed for a time when inmate numbers were lower and sentences were often shorter. Thick brick walls, narrow staircases, and confined landings were intended to restrict movement, not to support the complex needs of a modern prison population. The original cell design reflects this outdated philosophy. Cells were built for single occupancy, with limited natural light, poor ventilation, and minimal sanitation. In the Victorian era, prisoners spent long hours alone, and the system relied on silence as a method of discipline. Today, those same small cells are frequently shared by two inmates, placing intense pressure on space that was never meant to be shared. Corridors and wings within the prison are tight and restrictive, making movement difficult during unlock periods. When large numbers of inmates are released from their cells at the same time, congestion becomes unavoidable. This physical bottleneck increases tension, heightens the risk of confrontation, and limits officers' ability to respond quickly to incidents when violence breaks out. The prison's layout also complicates modern security demands. Blind spots, outdated sight lines, and limited room for surveillance technology reduce effective monitoring. While Victorian designers believed the structure allowed total control, modern prison realities reveal gaps where contraband can circulate and conflicts can escalate without immediate detection. Healthcare, education, and rehabilitation spaces were never part of the original design. As these services became essential in the modern prison system, they were added as adaptations rather than purpose-built facilities. Makeshift classrooms, cramped medical rooms, and overused communal areas struggle to meet demand, especially with an overcrowded population. Fire safety and emergency evacuation procedures are another challenge created by the old design. Narrow stairwells and locked gate systems slow response times during emergencies. In a prison operating beyond capacity, these structural limitations pose serious risks to both inmates and staff, especially during disturbances or medical crises. The Victorian structure also reinforces a harsh living environment. Poor temperature control makes cells unbearably cold in winter and stifling in summer. Limited access to fresh air and outdoor space adds to physical discomfort, which in turn fuels frustration and aggression among prisoners confined for long hours. Despite repeated inspections and reports highlighting these issues, the core structure remains unchanged. The prison continues to operate within walls designed for a different century, forcing modern prison management to function inside an environment that actively resists reform and adaptation. HMP Hull is plagued by chronic overcrowding, a problem that has escalated over decades and now defines daily life within its walls. Originally built to house a few hundred inmates, the prison frequently accommodates far more than its intended capacity. This persistent overpopulation stretches every resource to its limits, from basic living space to staffing, healthcare, and rehabilitation programs. Cells intended for single occupancy are now regularly shared by 2 or even 3 inmates, creating intense pressure on personal space. Inmates must navigate cramped sleeping quarters, limited storage for personal belongings, and shared facilities that were never designed for multiple occupants. Tensions rise easily when individuals are forced into close proximity for prolonged periods, and even minor disputes can quickly escalate into violence. Overcrowding affects daily schedules and routines. Mealtimes, recreational periods, and access to showers or outdoor yards are all compromised, with long waits and restricted time windows. Officers are forced to manage large groups in confined spaces, often leading to delays in movement and increased potential for conflict. Simple logistical tasks become sources of stress for both staff and prisoners. The strain of overcrowding also impacts staff morale and safety. Officers face daily challenges controlling a population that far exceeds the facility's original design. Each wing may hold hundreds of inmates while being supervised by only a few officers, leaving staff vulnerable and heightening the risk of assaults. Exhaustion and stress contribute to mistakes or slower responses, further exacerbating safety concerns. Healthcare services are overwhelmed by the sheer volume of prisoners. Medical staff must care for a population that grows beyond the capacity of clinics, with long waits for appointments and insufficient access to mental health support. Chronic conditions, injuries, and psychological distress are often left untreated, contributing to behavioral issues and escalating tension among inmates. Education and rehabilitation programs suffer under overcrowding. Classrooms and workshops can only accommodate limited numbers, leaving many prisoners without access to meaningful activities. Without constructive outlets, boredom and frustration intensify, fueling antisocial behavior and increasing the likelihood of violence. Overcrowding also strains the prison's infrastructure. Plumbing, heating, and electrical systems are under constant pressure, often failing to meet the needs of the population. Maintenance is reactive rather than proactive, creating living conditions that are uncomfortable and unsafe. Structural wear and tear accelerates, and complaints about sanitation and hygiene become commonplace. Ultimately, severe overcrowding transforms the daily environment of HMP Hull into one of constant tension and instability. It magnifies existing problems of violence, stress, and neglect, making every interaction, from staff supervision to inmate relationships, more precarious. The prison operates in a state of perpetual overcapacity, a pressure cooker where small sparks of conflict can ignite serious incidents at any moment. At Hull, shared cells have become the norm rather than the exception, a direct consequence of chronic overcrowding. Spaces originally intended for a single inmate are now inhabited by 2 or more individuals, creating a constant atmosphere of tension. Personal privacy is almost non-existent, and the pressure of living in such close quarters amplifies even minor disagreements into significant conflicts. The lack of space affects every aspect of daily life. Inmates must coordinate sleeping arrangements, personal belongings, and even time at the small cell desk. Shared amenities, such as sinks or toilets, become sources of frustration and frequent arguments. Confined proximity leaves little room for retreat, so even small irritations can escalate rapidly, often drawing in other prisoners in the same wing. Personality clashes are common in shared cells. Prisoners come from diverse backgrounds, with varying temperaments and coping mechanisms. Some may have histories of violence or aggression, while others struggle with mental health or addiction issues. Forced coexistence under stressful conditions increases the likelihood of disputes, intimidation, and bullying, sometimes culminating in physical assaults. Cell sharing also intensifies the impact of power dynamics and informal hierarchies among inmates. Dominant individuals may assert control over their cellmates' movements, possessions, or routines. Debt, coercion, and threats can emerge within these confined spaces, turning shared cells into arenas for psychological manipulation and dominance battles. Confined quarters make communication and social interaction more strained. Anger and resentment can fester over trivial matters such as noise, personal hygiene, or eating habits. Minor disputes that might be easily avoided in a more spacious environment can quickly spiral into prolonged conflicts with consequences beyond the cell itself. Staff supervision is complicated by shared cells. Guards must monitor relationships and intervene when tensions rise, but overcrowded wings limit visibility and access. Incidents within cells may go unnoticed until they escalate, making timely intervention difficult and increasing risks for both prisoners and officers. Living in shared cells also affects mental health. Constant lack of privacy, inability to control one's environment, and persistent exposure to conflict heighten stress and anxiety. Over time, this can lead to aggressive outbursts, withdrawal, or self-harm, further straining the prison's already overburdened support systems. Ultimately, shared cells at HMP Hull are a flashpoint for tension and conflict, a daily reminder of how overcrowding transforms the prison environment. What was once a space for containment and reflection has become a pressure cooker, where personal disputes, power struggles, and psychological stress converge, shaping the volatile atmosphere of the prison. Life inside the overcrowded wings of HMP Hull is defined by confinement, tension, and constant vigilance. Prisoners spend most of their time within tight corridors and shared cells, with limited access to the outside world or communal spaces. Every movement, from meal times to recreation periods, is structured and often rushed due to the sheer number of inmates occupying each wing. Morning routines begin early, but space constraints make even simple tasks like showering, dressing, or retrieving personal items a challenge. Lines form quickly at sinks, toilets, and lockers, leaving inmates frustrated and stressed before the day even begins. These small pressures can easily spark arguments, which, in an environment already fraught with overcrowding, can escalate rapidly. Meals are another significant point of tension. Dining halls or communal areas are overcrowded, forcing inmates to wait long periods or eat in shifts. The lack of personal space during meals and the close proximity of large numbers of people can exacerbate anxiety and create an environment ripe for conflict. Even minor disputes over food, seating, or queues can ignite larger confrontations. Recreation time, meant to provide relief and physical activity, is limited and heavily scheduled. The yard or gym area can hold only a fraction of the population at once, requiring strict rotation systems. This restriction reduces opportunities for exercise, relaxation, and socialization, leading to boredom and increased irritability. Overcrowding amplifies the sense of confinement, making inmates more prone to aggressive behavior. Daily routines are also marked by extended lockup periods due to staffing shortages and safety concerns. Prisoners may spend hours in their cells with minimal human contact, except for their cellmate. This prolonged isolation, combined with the stress of overcrowding, contributes to mental health issues and heightens the potential for conflicts once prisoners are unlocked. Hygiene and sanitation in the wings are compromised by overcrowding. Shared bathrooms and showers see heavy use, often without sufficient cleaning or maintenance. The spread of germs, lack of privacy, and constant exposure to cramped conditions exacerbates stress and discomfort, leaving inmates physically and mentally drained. Interaction between inmates is a constant balancing act. Informal hierarchies, power struggles, and personal disputes play out in corridors and common areas. Prisoners must navigate threats, intimidation, and alliances daily, which becomes increasingly difficult when space is limited and supervision is stretched thin. Overall, daily life in the overcrowded wings of HMP Hull is a relentless test of endurance, patience, and resilience. The prison's physical limitations, combined with high population density, create an environment where stress, frustration, and potential violence are ever present, defining the lived experience of those behind its walls. Within HMP Hull, inmate-on-inmate violence has surged in recent years, a direct consequence of overcrowding, shared cells, and the daily pressures of prison life. Confined spaces, lack of privacy, and constant stress create a volatile environment where disputes can quickly escalate into physical confrontations. Fights are no longer isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern that affects the safety and well-being of everyone inside. Violence often arises from minor disagreements that would be manageable outside prison walls. Conflicts over personal space, cell territory, or belongings can ignite intense altercations. In a wing packed beyond its intended capacity, tensions are magnified, leaving prisoners little room to de-escalate or avoid conflict. Even routine interactions in corridors or during meal times carry the risk of turning violent. Gang influence and informal hierarchies amplify the prevalence of inmate-on-inmate aggression. Stronger or more dominant prisoners assert control over others, enforcing unwritten rules through intimidation or physical force. Disobedience or perceived disrespect can lead to immediate retaliation, creating a cycle of violence that spreads throughout the wing and impacts even those who are not directly involved. Contraband, including drugs and mobile phones, is a frequent source of conflict. Inmates may fight over territory, debts, or access to illicit items, which fuels tension and heightens the likelihood of assaults. Drug-related violence often escalates rapidly and can involve multiple prisoners at once, creating dangerous situations that are difficult for staff to contain. The psychological toll of constant threat contributes to further violence. Stress, frustration, and mental health struggles can make prisoners more reactive and less able to control anger. Inmates already coping with trauma or addiction may lash out more readily, turning even minor provocations into serious incidents. Overcrowding intensifies these dynamics. With more people crammed into each wing, Conflicts that might have been isolated in a less crowded environment quickly spread. Noise, lack of escape routes, and constant proximity increase the likelihood that a dispute will escalate before staff can intervene. Prison officers are forced to respond to violent incidents while managing an overwhelming population. Limited staff numbers and stretched resources mean that some fights escalate before intervention is possible, and repeated exposure to violence also affects officer morale and safety. In turn, this can create a tense feedback loop, with prisoners perceiving weaknesses in control, prompting further aggression. In summary, the rise in inmate-on-inmate violence at HMP Hull is both a symptom and a consequence of the prison's structural and systemic challenges. Overcrowding, stressful living conditions, and lack of adequate support combine to create an environment where physical confrontation becomes an almost inevitable part of daily life, defining the experience for many prisoners inside the facility. At HMP Hull, assaults on prison staff have become increasingly common, reflecting the intense pressure that overcrowding and violence place on the facility. Officers are on the front lines of an environment where tensions run high, and their role requires constant vigilance, patience, and physical readiness. Unfortunately, the combination of high inmate numbers, shared cells, and frequent conflicts create situations where staff are frequently at risk. Physical attacks can occur anywhere within the prison: corridors, wings, dining halls, or during prisoner movements. Officers often face sudden, unprovoked violence when intervening in disputes, enforcing rules, or conducting searches. Overcrowding exacerbates these risks, as there are simply more inmates for each officer to supervise, leaving gaps in monitoring and increasing the likelihood of unexpected confrontations. Assaults are not always spontaneous. They can be premeditated. Inmates may target staff in retaliation for disciplinary actions, perceived unfair treatment, or enforcement of prison rules. Gang influence plays a role here as well, with organized groups sometimes directing aggression toward officers to demonstrate power or intimidate others within the prison. The psychological impact on staff is profound. Officers regularly face threats to their safety, verbal abuse, and actual physical harm, leading to stress, anxiety, and burnout. Long-term exposure to violence can affect decision-making, reduce morale, and even contribute to staff shortages, further compounding the challenges of managing an overcrowded prison. Staff are also responsible for managing inmates' mental health crises, drug-related incidents, and emergency situations, all of which can escalate into assaults if not handled carefully. With limited training and resources, officers often must improvise responses, increasing the risk of confrontation. Overcrowded wings intensify these difficulties, making even routine duties potentially dangerous. Personal protective equipment and security protocols help mitigate risk, but they cannot eliminate it entirely. Officers must constantly navigate narrow corridors, crowded communal areas, and confined cells, all while maintaining authority and avoiding escalation. The physical limitations of the Victorian-era prison design amplify these challenges. Incidents of assault can have long-term repercussions for the prison environment. When staff are injured or feel unsafe, operational efficiency suffers. Lockdowns, restricted movement, and increased security measures become more frequent, affecting both prisoners and officers. Inmates may perceive these disruptions as weaknesses or opportunities to challenge authority, creating a cycle of tension and aggression. Ultimately, assaults on staff at HMP Hull are not isolated events, but part of a larger pattern driven by overcrowding, stress, and systemic challenges. Officers operate under constant threat, balancing the need for control with personal safety, while the prison structure and population pressures make every interaction potentially volatile. Within HMP Hull, drugs and contraband play a major role in fueling tension, violence, and unrest among inmates. Despite strict security measures, items such as illegal drugs, tobacco, mobile phones, and makeshift weapons frequently circulate within the prison. Their presence exacerbates conflicts, strengthens informal power structures, and creates an underground economy that deeply affects daily life behind bars. Drugs are often a central source of conflict between prisoners. Debt, addiction, and competition for supply lines frequently spark disputes, sometimes escalating into violent altercations. Inmates may feel pressure to join gangs or alliances to protect their access to drugs, or to avoid retribution from those controlling the trade. These dynamics make the wings unpredictable and heighten the overall risk of confrontation. Contraband also contributes to the intimidation of vulnerable prisoners. Inmates who refuse to participate in illegal activities may be threatened or coerced, while those in debt or unable to pay for substances can face violence or exploitation. The circulation of contraband effectively creates parallel systems of control that undermine official authority and make managing the prison population significantly more challenging. The smuggling of items into the prison is facilitated by both external and internal networks. Visitors, corrupt staff, or cleverly hidden packages can introduce drugs and other contraband into HMP Hull. Once inside, these items often circulate undetected, spreading conflict across wings and increasing tension between prisoners who compete for access or control. Addiction amplifies aggression and unpredictability. Inmates experiencing withdrawal may become irritable, violent, or desperate, which can trigger confrontations with both fellow prisoners and staff. Overcrowding magnifies this effect, as the stress of confinement combined with substance dependency creates a highly volatile environment. The presence of mobile phones, often used to coordinate gang activity or plan attacks, further destabilizes the prison. Inmates with access to phones can communicate externally, reinforcing criminal networks and extending influence beyond the prison walls. These devices undermine rehabilitation efforts and complicate security measures. Staff face significant challenges in addressing drugs and contraband. Searches, surveillance, and intelligence gathering are essential, but can only partially mitigate the issue, especially in an overcrowded facility where visibility is limited and resources are stretched. The constant threat of contraband-related violence makes every routine interaction potentially risky. Ultimately, drugs and contraband at HMP Hull act as catalysts for violence, stress, and systemic dysfunction. They exacerbate existing tensions from overcrowding and cell sharing, reinforce informal hierarchies, and make maintaining order far more difficult, creating a cycle where substance-related problems perpetuate instability throughout the prison. Gang culture has a significant presence within HMP Hull, and it heavily shapes the prison environment. Overcrowding and shared cells create ideal conditions for gangs to assert dominance, recruit members, and enforce informal rules. For many inmates, joining a gang can feel like a necessity for protection, access to contraband, or social status, while refusal may leave them vulnerable to intimidation or attack. In HMP Hull, gang influence is visible in every aspect of daily life. Inmates often organize themselves into informal hierarchies based on age, reputation, or criminal background. Dominant individuals or groups assert control over cell allocation, access to resources, and even movement within wings. This social order operates alongside, and sometimes above, official prison rules, making enforcement challenging for staff. Intimidation is a common tool used by gangs to maintain authority. Verbal threats, displays of aggression, and acts of violence create a climate of fear. Vulnerable prisoners, those new to the system, small in stature, or lacking affiliations, often become targets. The constant threat of intimidation limits personal freedom, restricts movement within the prison, and increases stress levels. Contraband and drug distribution are frequently controlled by gangs. They use these items to consolidate power, enforce debts, and manipulate other prisoners. Competition over these resources can spark violent clashes, not only between rival gangs but also between independent inmates trying to operate outside established hierarchies. Gang involvement intensifies the risk of organized violence. Coordinated attacks, retaliation for perceived slights, or enforcement of rules can lead to sudden and severe incidents. Overcrowding exacerbates these situations, as multiple factions are forced into close proximity, increasing the chance of spontaneous outbreaks of conflict. The psychological impact of gang dominance is profound. Prisoners often live in fear of retribution, adjusting behavior to avoid confrontation or comply with gang-imposed expectations. This constant tension contributes to stress, anxiety, and aggression, which in turn can feed further violence within the wings. Staff face immense challenges managing gang activity. Officers must identify rivalries, monitor alliances, and intervene when necessary, all while operating in overcrowded wings where visibility is limited. Attempts to disrupt gang networks are complicated by a lack of resources and the persistence of informal social structures among inmates. Ultimately, gang culture and intimidation permeate life at HMP Hull, reinforcing violence and undermining rehabilitation. The combination of fear, control over contraband, and social dominance makes gang influence one of the most persistent and destabilizing factors in the prison's overcrowded, high-tension environment. HMP Hull, staff shortages are a chronic problem, and their effects are felt throughout every wing of the prison. The facility is overcrowded, yet the number of officers has not increased proportionally, leaving each staff member responsible for supervising far more inmates than is safe or manageable. This imbalance contributes directly to heightened tension, slower response times, and increased risk of both inmate-on-inmate and inmate-on-staff violence. Officers working in HMP Hull face long, physically and mentally demanding shifts. The stress of managing large groups in confined, overcrowded spaces takes a toll on concentration, decision-making, and emotional resilience. Repeated exposure to violent incidents, verbal abuse, and the constant threat of assault contributes to both physical and psychological exhaustion. Many officers report feeling stretched to their limits, which can affect morale and job satisfaction. Burnout among staff also reduces the effectiveness of rehabilitation programs and daily prison management. Officers who are fatigued or overworked may struggle to enforce rules consistently, respond promptly to incidents, or provide guidance to inmates. Over time, this can create a sense of disorder and frustration among prisoners, who perceive lapses in authority as an opportunity to challenge control. Shortages often force temporary or inexperienced staff into high-pressure roles for which they may be ill-prepared. Lack of adequate training, combined with the intensity of the environment, increases the risk of mistakes or accidents, further endangering both staff and inmates. In some cases, officers may become overly cautious or reactive, which can unintentionally escalate conflicts. The emotional strain of working under these conditions is significant. Constant vigilance, exposure to violence, and the need to maintain authority in a hostile environment contribute to high levels of stress, anxiety, and even post-traumatic symptoms. Officer burnout can lead to absenteeism, staff turnover, and difficulty recruiting new personnel, perpetuating the staffing crisis. Staff shortages also have a direct impact on daily prison routines. Meal times, cell unlocks, recreational periods, and prisoner movements may be delayed or restricted, creating further frustration for inmates. Reduced supervision increases the likelihood of violence, drug use, and other forms of rule-breaking, putting even more pressure on the already limited staff. The imbalance between the number of prisoners and available officers undermines both safety and rehabilitation. Overcrowded wings require constant monitoring, but with fewer staff, certain areas become more prone to conflict. Officers must prioritize immediate threats over long-term interventions, reducing opportunities for meaningful engagement with prisoners. At HMP Hull, lockdowns have become a frequent and defining feature of prison life, primarily driven by overcrowding and the inability of staff to maintain full control over wings. When tensions rise or incidents of violence occur, Large sections of the prison are locked down for extended periods to prevent further clashes. These lockdowns, while necessary for safety, have profound effects on inmates' daily routines and mental well-being. Lockdown regimes often restrict movement for hours or even entire days. Inmates may be confined to their cells with minimal interaction, limited access to showers, exercise, or educational programs. This prolonged confinement intensifies feelings of frustration and boredom, which can fuel further tension and aggression once normal routines resume. The very measure intended to maintain order can inadvertently exacerbate the underlying causes of conflict. The decision to implement a lockdown is typically triggered by incidents that officers cannot immediately contain. Overcrowding means that staff-to-prisoner ratios are often insufficient, so even a small fight can escalate quickly, prompting a precautionary lockdown to prevent the situation from spreading. Lockdowns are also used after the discovery of contraband or gang-related activity to restore control and allow staff to investigate. Lockdowns disrupt the prison's operational schedule. Meal distribution, healthcare appointments, and access to rehabilitation or education programs are delayed or cancelled. Inmates are forced to spend long periods in cramped, shared cells, which can worsen mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, and aggression. These disruptions also affect prisoners who have no involvement in the incident that triggered the lockdown, creating resentment and a sense of collective punishment. During lockdowns, communication with family and legal representatives may be limited, adding to inmates' stress and sense of isolation. For prisoners reliant on support networks outside the prison, restricted access to phones or visitation can be particularly damaging. In the long term, repeated lockdowns reduce engagement with rehabilitative programs, undermining the prison's role in preparing inmates for eventual release. Officers face their own challenges during lockdowns. While these measures provide a temporary method to regain control, they require intensive supervision to ensure compliance and prevent further incidents within the confined population. The physical and psychological strain on staff is heightened, particularly in overcrowded wings where tensions are already elevated. Lockdown regimes also have long-term consequences for the overall prison environment. Constant cycles of tension, violence, and confinement create a climate of instability, reducing trust between staff and prisoners. Inmates may become more oppositional or aggressive, anticipating future lockdowns and viewing restrictions as part of an ongoing struggle for control. Ultimately, lockdowns at HMP Hull are both a symptom and a tool of a system under stress. They highlight the challenges of managing an overcrowded and volatile population within a Victorian-era prison, demonstrating how attempts to maintain order can inadvertently contribute to the cycle of tension, aggression, and unrest inside the wings. HMP Hull, mental health support is chronically overstretched, leaving many prisoners without the care they desperately need. Overcrowding and resource limitations mean that counseling, psychiatric services, and specialized interventions are insufficient for the population's scale and complexity. For many inmates, untreated mental health conditions exacerbate tensions, aggression, and vulnerability to exploitation. Prisoners with anxiety, depression, or trauma-related disorders often struggle to cope with a confined, high-pressure environment. The Victorian-era design of HMP Hull, with cramped cells, limited natural light, and long periods of isolation, amplifies stress and psychological distress. Without timely mental health support, minor triggers can escalate into aggressive or self-harming behavior. Access to trained mental health professionals is limited. Staff shortages and budget constraints reduce the frequency of therapy sessions and psychiatric assessments. Many prisoners must wait weeks or months to see a clinician, if at all, leaving their conditions untreated or inadequately managed. In some cases, medication may be delayed or rationed, further compromising mental well-being. The lack of support is particularly critical for inmates with dual diagnoses, such as mental illness combined with substance addiction. These individuals are at heightened risk of violent outbursts, withdrawal symptoms, and susceptibility to gang recruitment. Inadequate treatment contributes directly to behavioral problems that affect not only the individual, but also the safety of the wider prison community. Group programs designed to provide coping strategies, stress management, or rehabilitation are limited in availability. Overcrowded wings mean that workshops and classes cannot accommodate all prisoners, leaving many without constructive outlets for emotional regulation. The absence of these programs contributes to boredom, frustration, and escalating conflict. Isolation policies intended to manage violent or high-risk inmates can worsen mental health outcomes. Prisoners confined to cells for long periods experience heightened anxiety, depression, and irritability. Without adequate mental health interventions, these conditions can intensify, leading to self-harm, aggression, or even suicidal behavior. Staff training on recognizing and responding to mental health crises is often insufficient. Officers, already stretched thin due to overcrowding, must balance security responsibilities with providing support to vulnerable inmates. This dual responsibility can overwhelm staff, who may unintentionally overlook warning signs or fail to intervene early in escalating situations. Overall, the scarcity of mental health support at HMP Hull perpetuates a cycle of stress, aggression, and violence. Overcrowding, shared cells, and under-resourced healthcare amplify the challenges faced by inmates, leaving many to navigate their psychological struggles in an environment that is ill-equipped to meet their needs. At HMP Hull, inmates often spend long stretches of time confined to their cells due to overcrowding, staffing shortages, and security concerns. Cells designed for single occupancy now hold 2 or more prisoners, and when wings are overcrowded, officers are forced to keep large groups locked up for extended periods. These prolonged lock-ins dominate daily life and significantly affect both mental and physical well-being. Extended confinement leaves prisoners with little opportunity for movement or exercise. Even basic activities, such as walking to the bathroom or spending time in the yard, are heavily restricted. With limited access to communal areas or recreational facilities, inmates experience physical stagnation, muscle weakness, and elevated stress levels. The lack of activity can contribute to restlessness, irritability, and a higher likelihood of conflict once prisoners are unlocked. Time spent locked in cells also exacerbates mental health challenges. Inmates with anxiety, depression, or trauma-related conditions are particularly vulnerable to isolation. The constant proximity to cellmates, combined with minimal privacy, creates additional psychological stress. Without access to therapy, counseling, or structured programs, these conditions often worsen, increasing tension and the risk of aggressive behavior. Boredom is another critical factor. With educational programs, work opportunities, and recreational activities limited by overcrowding and staff shortages, prisoners often face long periods of unstructured time. This idle time can lead to frustration, anger, and antisocial behavior, both within cells and across the wings. In some cases, boredom fuels rule-breaking or involvement in illicit activities to occupy time. Extended lock-ins also affect social dynamics within shared cells. Confined together for hours on end, cellmates may clash over personal space, hygiene, or minor irritations. Without adequate outlets for stress relief, even small disagreements can escalate into serious disputes, contributing to the overall climate of tension and violence in the prison. Healthcare access is further impacted by prolonged confinement. Inmates may miss medical appointments or have reduced opportunities to meet with mental health professionals. This delay in care can worsen chronic conditions and leave medical or psychological issues untreated, further straining the prison environment. Officers must manage the consequences of long lock-in periods carefully. Extended confinement often leads to heightened aggression, making cell unlocks and prisoner movement more challenging. Staff must balance safety with providing inmates access to limited facilities, creating a constant operational challenge in overcrowded wings. Ultimately, long hours spent locked in cells at HMP Hull amplify the effects of overcrowding, stress, and violence. They create an environment where frustration, boredom, and mental health struggles converge, shaping the daily reality for prisoners and intensifying the challenges faced by staff in maintaining order. Isolation at HMP Hull has a profound effect on inmate behavior, particularly regarding aggression and tension. While intended as a management tool to separate violent or high-risk prisoners, prolonged isolation often intensifies frustration, anxiety, and hostility. Inmates confined alone or with minimal contact may struggle to regulate emotions, increasing the likelihood of violent outbursts once they rejoin the general population. The physical environment of isolation amplifies these effects. Cells are small, sparsely furnished, and often lack natural light or ventilation, creating a sense of confinement and sensory deprivation. Overcrowding elsewhere in the prison means that isolation is frequently the only option for managing difficult inmates, even though the space was not designed for long-term psychological support. Mental health challenges are exacerbated by isolation. Prisoners with pre-existing conditions, such as depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, or anxiety, may experience worsening symptoms. The lack of social interaction and reduced access to counseling or group programs contributes to heightened stress levels and irritability, which can manifest as aggression towards staff or other inmates. Isolation can also disrupt social coping mechanisms. Prisoners in communal wings often rely on structured routines, peer support, or relationships to manage stress. Being removed from these networks creates a sense of vulnerability and frustration, leaving inmates more reactive when they return to crowded, high-pressure wings. Even minor provocations can trigger aggressive responses. The limited activities available during isolation contribute to boredom and restlessness, which further fuels aggression. Inmates may pace, shout, or engage in self-harming behaviors as a way to release tension. Over time, this pent-up energy can manifest in confrontations, both within cells and when interacting with others in the prison. Isolation also affects interpersonal relationships. Prisoners who have spent extended periods separated from peers may struggle to reintegrate into wings, misinterpreting social cues or reacting defensively to perceived threats. These difficulties can create cycles of conflict, with aggressive behavior leading to further isolation and escalating tensions. Staff management is complicated by these effects. Officers must balance the need for safety with the understanding that isolation may worsen behavioral problems. Reintegrating prisoners safely requires careful monitoring, which is challenging in an overcrowded environment with limited personnel. Ultimately, isolation at HMP Hull, while intended to maintain order, often has the opposite effect. The psychological strain, frustration, and lack of social support inherent in isolation can increase aggression, undermine rehabilitation efforts, and contribute to the cycle of violence that defines daily life in the overcrowded prison. At HMP Hull, access to rehabilitation and education programs is severely limited, primarily due to overcrowding and insufficient resources. While these programs are designed to equip inmates with skills, knowledge, and coping mechanisms for life after prison, high population numbers and constrained space mean that many prisoners miss out entirely. The lack of constructive activities contributes to frustration, idleness, and tension within the wings. Classrooms, workshops, and vocational training areas are often overcrowded or operating at reduced capacity. Inmates may be forced to wait weeks or months for a place on a course, if one is even available. Programs that once aimed to reduce reoffending, such as literacy, numeracy, and vocational skill building, cannot reach the majority of prisoners, limiting opportunities for personal growth or rehabilitation. The scarcity of education programs is compounded by the prison's outdated infrastructure. Victorian-era design limits the size and number of rooms suitable for teaching or workshops. Makeshift classrooms struggle to accommodate modern learning needs, with overcrowded spaces and minimal equipment reducing the effectiveness of any instruction provided. Work programs, intended to teach trade skills and instill discipline, also face significant limitations. High demand means that only a fraction of inmates can participate at a given time. For those left out, the resulting idle time fuels boredom, stress, and engagement in negative behaviors, including gang activity or contraband dealings. Rehabilitation initiatives addressing behavior, addiction, or mental health are similarly constrained. Programs designed to reduce aggression, manage anger, or support mental well-being are often oversubscribed, leaving many prisoners without support. Overcrowding means that group sessions are difficult to manage safely, and individualized interventions are almost impossible to deliver effectively. Limited program availability also affects long-term outcomes. Prisoners who cannot access education or rehabilitation leave HMP Hull with fewer tools to reintegrate into society. This perpetuates cycles of reoffending, contributing to overcrowding in the wider prison system and increasing the likelihood that future inmates will face the same lack of opportunity. The combination of overcrowding, insufficient staff, and inadequate facilities means that rehabilitation often takes a back seat to security concerns. Officers and administrators prioritize maintaining order, leaving limited capacity to focus on programs that could reduce violence and support inmates' personal development. In essence, the scarcity of rehabilitation and education programs at HMP Hull reinforces the systemic issues caused by overcrowding. Without access to constructive skill-building activities, prisoners remain idle, frustrated, and more prone to conflict, perpetuating the cycle of aggression, tension, and instability throughout the prison. In Hull, healthcare services face immense strain due to chronic overcrowding and the complex needs of the inmate population. The prison's medical facilities, originally designed for far fewer prisoners, are forced to accommodate a much larger population, creating delays in treatment, limited access to mental health care, and insufficient resources for chronic or acute conditions. Physical health needs are frequently unmet or delayed. Inmates with injuries, chronic illnesses, or urgent medical concerns may face long waits for appointments due to the sheer volume of patients. Overcrowding intensifies these challenges, as medical staff must prioritize emergencies, leaving routine care and preventative treatment underaddressed. Mental health services are particularly overwhelmed, with rising numbers of prisoners experiencing anxiety, depression, or trauma-related disorders. Counselors and psychiatric staff are stretched beyond capacity. Many inmates go weeks without access to therapy or psychological support, exacerbating behavioral issues and increasing the likelihood of violence or self-harm. Addiction treatment is similarly constrained. Many prisoners struggle with substance dependence, and drug rehabilitation programs are limited in scope and availability. Overcrowding prevents consistent participation, and withdrawal symptoms or relapses often go untreated, contributing to tension, aggression, and contraband-related problems. Staff shortages compound healthcare difficulties. Medical personnel must navigate a high-risk environment, balancing the need to treat inmates with maintaining personal safety. The physical limitations of Victorian-era cells and wings make it difficult to safely transport prisoners to clinics, further delaying care. Sanitation and hygiene issues also place additional pressure on healthcare services. Overcrowded cells and shared facilities increase the risk of infections and disease outbreaks. Medical staff must address these preventable health problems while managing the routine demands of the population, creating a constant cycle of strain and urgency. Emergency response is another area of concern. Overcrowding and narrow corridors slow access during medical crises, putting both prisoners and staff at risk. Limited resources mean that serious incidents, such as assaults or self-harm, can overwhelm medical teams, requiring difficult decisions about prioritization. Overall, the strain on healthcare services at HMP Hull illustrates the human cost of overcrowding. Physical and mental health needs go unmet, addiction and rehabilitation programs are limited, and staff operate under relentless pressure, all of which contribute to instability, frustration, and heightened risks of conflict within the prison environment. At HMP Hull, vulnerable prisoners face heightened risks due to overcrowding, violence, and the lack of adequate protective measures. Vulnerable inmates include those who are young, elderly, physically disabled, mentally ill, or serving sentences for non-violent offences. In an environment dominated by aggression and gang influence, these individuals often struggle to navigate daily life safely. Shared cells and cramped wings increase exposure to intimidation and potential assault. Vulnerable prisoners may be paired with stronger or more aggressive inmates, leaving them at risk of bullying, extortion, or physical harm. The pressure to comply with informal rules enforced by gangs or dominant prisoners can further compromise their safety and autonomy. Overcrowded communal areas such as yards, dining halls, and recreation spaces create additional hazards. Vulnerable inmates have limited space to avoid confrontations, and a constant proximity to more aggressive individuals increases the likelihood of physical or verbal attacks. Even routine activities, such as moving between wings or attending appointments, carry significant risk. Mental health challenges make some prisoners more susceptible to exploitation. Individuals experiencing anxiety, depression, or cognitive impairment may be unable to respond effectively to threats or manipulation. This vulnerability is often exploited by other inmates for financial gain, control over contraband, or influence within the prison hierarchy. Limited staff presence exacerbates these dangers. Officer shortages mean that vulnerable prisoners may not receive the supervision needed to protect them from bullying or violence. Rapid response to incidents is difficult, and preventative measures are often insufficient to keep at-risk individuals safe, particularly during peak periods of overcrowding or unrest. Healthcare and mental health services for vulnerable prisoners are similarly constrained. Delays in treatment, counseling, or medication can increase stress and agitation, making inmates more vulnerable to both victimization and conflict. Lack of adequate support contributes to a cycle of physical and psychological harm. Special housing units or protective regimes exist, but capacity is limited. With the prison operating above intended capacity, placement in these units is often unavailable, forcing vulnerable prisoners to remain in high-risk wings. This lack of protection reinforces anxiety, fear, and tension, affecting both individual well-being and overall wing stability. Ultimately, safety concerns for vulnerable prisoners at HMP Hull reflect the intersection of overcrowding, violence, and resource limitations. These inmates face daily threats to their physical and mental well-being, navigating an environment where survival often depends on compliance, resilience, and the precarious balance of power within the wings. HMP Hull, overcrowding, violence, and limited access to rehabilitation programs have a direct impact on reoffending rates and long-term rehabilitation outcomes. Prisoners who experience prolonged stress, restricted movement, and inadequate education or vocational training are less likely to develop the skills, coping mechanisms, or mindset necessary to reintegrate successfully into society. The lack of access to educational programs, vocational workshops, and skill-building opportunities significantly undermines rehabilitation efforts. Overcrowding means many inmates miss out on literacy, numeracy, or job training, leaving them without employable skills upon release. This gap increases the likelihood of returning to criminal activity to meet basic needs or maintain previous lifestyles. Mental health support is similarly limited, which exacerbates behavioral challenges. Prisoners struggling with untreated anxiety, depression, or trauma are more likely to exhibit aggression or struggle with authority, both inside prison and after release. Without therapeutic intervention, these patterns persist, making reintegration more difficult and increasing the risk of reoffending. The pervasive gang influence within HMP Hull further complicates rehabilitation. Inmates exposed to gang hierarchies, intimidation, and contraband economies may internalize criminal behaviors and social norms that are counterproductive to lawful reintegration. Leaving prison without having disengaged from these networks often leads to recidivism. Overcrowding and cell sharing contribute to a daily environment that fosters conflict and stress. Inmates learn survival tactics focused on aggression, intimidation, or manipulation rather than constructive problem-solving. These behavioral patterns, reinforced over long sentences, often carry over into life outside prison, increasing the probability of repeat offenses. Isolation and frequent lockdowns also have long-term consequences. Limited social interaction, restricted rehabilitation programming, and prolonged confinement hinder the development of communication, cooperation, and conflict resolution skills. Prisoners may leave HMP Hull ill-prepared to manage relationships or navigate societal norms without resorting to violence or illegal activity. The prison's structural limitations and resource shortages amplify these challenges. With insufficient staff, overcrowded wings, and outdated facilities, HMP Hull struggles to provide consistent, effective rehabilitation. Programs that do exist are often oversubscribed, poorly attended, or disrupted by violence and operational constraints, reducing their overall impact on recidivism reduction. Ultimately, the combined effects of overcrowding, violence, inadequate education, and limited mental health support at HMP Hull create an environment where rehabilitation is severely hindered. Many prisoners leave the institution without the tools needed for successful reintegration, perpetuating cycles of reoffending and contributing to the ongoing pressures faced by the prison system. At HMP Hull, chronic overcrowding, high levels of violence, and constant operational pressures have a profound effect on staff morale and retention. Officers face relentless stress, balancing the need to maintain order with personal safety concerns, all within a prison infrastructure that was never designed to handle the current population. Over time, these pressures erode job satisfaction and contribute to high turnover. Daily exposure to assaults, verbal abuse, and aggressive incidents creates a sense of fatigue and emotional exhaustion among staff. Officers working in overcrowded wings must constantly monitor conflicts, respond to emergencies, and enforce rules under conditions where the number of prisoners far exceeds safe supervision levels. This persistent strain fosters burnout and a feeling of being undervalued or overwhelmed. Limited resources and understaffing exacerbate the problem. Officers are often required to cover multiple roles simultaneously, from security checks and prisoner supervision to supporting rehabilitation programs and handling medical or mental health crises. The pressure to perform all these tasks in an overcrowded environment leaves little room for reflection, rest, or professional development, further decreasing morale. Staff retention is directly affected by these conditions. Experienced officers may seek transfers, leave the profession, or retire early to escape the stress and danger of working in a high-risk, overcrowded prison. Recruitment of new personnel becomes more difficult, as potential candidates are deterred by the facility's reputation and the challenges reported by current staff. Low morale among staff can also impact prisoner management. Overworked or demoralized officers may struggle to enforce rules consistently, respond promptly to conflicts, or engage with rehabilitation initiatives. Inmates may perceive this as a weakness in authority, potentially increasing resistance, aggression, and non-compliance, creating a feedback loop that further pressures staff. Psychological effects on officers are significant. Constant vigilance, fear of violence, and exposure to traumatic incidents contribute to stress, anxiety, and symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Without sufficient support systems, counseling, or time to decompress, staff may experience long-term mental health consequences. Operational challenges caused by low morale and staff shortages also affect the broader prison environment. Increased incidents of violence, delayed movements, and inconsistent rule enforcement reduce overall safety for both prisoners and officers. The inability to maintain a stable, predictable environment undermines rehabilitation efforts and perpetuates tension within the wings. Ultimately, overcrowding, violence, and systemic pressures at HMP Hull create a workplace environment that is mentally and physically taxing. Staff morale suffers, retention declines, and the cycle of stress, burnout, and operational instability continues, impacting both officers and the prison population they are responsible for managing. HMP Hull, the Victorian-era design presents significant obstacles to modernization and reform. Built for a far smaller population and a different approach to incarceration, the prison structure limits the ability to implement contemporary safety measures, rehabilitation programs, and technological solutions, making it extremely difficult to address the challenges of overcrowding, violence, and staff strain. The architecture of HMP Hull, with narrow corridors, small cells, and multiple wings, was intended for strict control rather than flexible operations. Modern prison management requires spaces for education, rehabilitation, healthcare, and recreation, but the old layout restricts room for classrooms, workshops, medical clinics, or gyms. Any modifications are constrained by the building's original footprint and structural limitations. Security upgrades are similarly complicated. CCTV cameras, electronic monitoring, and improved surveillance systems are harder to install and operate effectively in a facility with blind spots, confined stairwells, and thick brick walls. Officers must rely heavily on manual observation, which is challenging when staff numbers are limited and prisoner numbers exceed capacity. Ventilation, lighting, and sanitation systems are outdated and insufficient for modern standards. Overcrowding exacerbates these problems, with shared facilities and close quarters creating hygiene concerns and contributing to the spread of illness. Upgrading these systems within the constraints of a Victorian-era building is costly and logistically challenging. Modern rehabilitation programs require adaptable spaces for group activities, workshops, and counseling sessions, but overcrowded wings and rigid cell structures leave little room for such initiatives. Even when programs exist, they are often oversubscribed or disrupted by violence, limiting their effectiveness and preventing prisoners from gaining skills that reduce reoffending. Emergency procedures are also compromised by the old design. Narrow stairways, locked doors, and confined corridors hinder evacuation during fires, medical emergencies, or violent incidents. Staff must implement workarounds to maintain safety, but these solutions are often temporary and less effective than purpose-built modern facilities. Financial and administrative constraints further complicate modernization. Retrofitting a historic prison is expensive, and budgets are often stretched thin managing day-to-day operations. As a result, essential improvements are delayed or implemented in piecemeal fashion, leaving the facility vulnerable to overcrowding-related challenges, security gaps, and structural limitations. Ultimately, the Victorian-era design of HMP Hull creates a persistent tension between the historical architecture and modern prison requirements. Overcrowding, violence, and inadequate facilities are magnified by structural constraints, making reform difficult and perpetuating an environment where both prisoners and staff face daily challenges in safety, rehabilitation, and well-being.